Hey guys, welcome. Thanks for joining us today as we wrap up our 3-week Christmas series titled The Fullness. And we've been talking the past few weeks about how Jesus was the fullness of God, the fullness of man, and then I'm super excited to discuss our topic today, joined by a man who asked me if I would introduce him, but he needs no introduction. I think we all know. Even if he hasn't preached on his campus, you've probably heard about him.
The rumors.
Yes, Rocky Hernandez.
So good to be here with you today. I'm so excited about your sermon, not only just because it's been a great series, but really to tie this up, it seems so abstract, just even your title. The Fullness of Time. What is that all about? Like, what are you talking about in there?
Fullness of time.
Is it okay if we just jump in and start right now? I'm raring to go.
You know, I'm ready.
Yeah.
So, the funny thing is actually that, so the first two, this is going to be a 3-week Christmas series. Let's pull the curtain back.
Yeah.
This is going to be a 3-week Christmas series. And where we wanted to talk about how Jesus is fully God and fully man, and we needed a third week. And we were like, well, we're going to talk about that third week. And so we had...
so the third topic came out of necessity.
Yeah, kind of.
Sometimes it works out that way.
But, you know, in the way that God works things, which is kind of the central message of this sermon, is that it really feels like, man, God had us going down this path because we were focusing on that word fullness.
Right.
And so coming out of Colossians 1, verse 14, I believe, where it says, in him, Jesus, all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell.
Right.
And so we were keying off that word fullness. Fullness of God, fullness of man. What's the third one? Well, there's this verse in Galatians 4, chapter 4, where it says, but when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law. And so that's kind of where we started going, because it's fullness, and it's also talking about the birth of Jesus. The thing I love about that verse is it actually combines the 3 threads that we're talking about here in this series. Fullness of time had come. God sent forth his son. That speaks to Jesus' divinity. Born of a woman speaks of his humanity. When did it happen? At the fullness of time. And so what we see here is the person of Jesus is this 3-way intersection of God, man, and time.
And really, when you say the fullness of time, you mean like everything was perfect and had come to fruition, and this was the perfect time for this to occur, right?
Yeah, so there's a couple different ways that you can look at that phrase fullness of time, and many biblical scholars have examined and tried to answer what exactly does that mean. Yeah. Because the passage doesn't really, it kind of gives us some context, but it doesn't really tell us what that means. And this is the only time that phrase is in the New Testament. So people have studied it, and people have kind of taken it from a couple different angles. So the first one is geopolitical, and they're looking at it and they're saying, oh yeah, it was the fullness of time because look, Jerusalem was occupied by the Roman government at the time, and Rome had built all these roads, and so the gospel could get out.
There was a common language.
There's a common language. Everybody was speaking Koine Greek, even though it was Roman, everybody was speaking Koine Greek. And also, it was this time of religious upheaval already, to where people were kind of looking for something more than these false gods that they were worshiping. And so like all these factors came together. And so some people analyze it from that geopolitical bent. And I think that's totally part of it. Right. And then other people look at the spiritual bent of it. Right. And that's kind of where Galatians 4, the broader context, takes us.
And actually, I want to talk to you about that specifically, because you start your sermon with this very intense verse actually at the end in the book of Revelation, and it says, Revelation 13:8, all inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast, all those whose name have not been written in the Lamb's book of life. The Lamb was slain from the creation of the world. So you say this statement, God had a plan for your forgiveness before your first failure. God was making moves to forgive before. God was preparing for your forgiveness before your failure came to pass. Yeah. And I think, man, like God had a plan from the beginning, and spiritually, that's huge.
Yeah, totally. So, yeah, I don't really know how to talk through this without, I feel like, giving away the final point. And me and you, we both preach similarly. We like to hold tension as long as you can.
Oh, for sure. And then drop the bomb.
Yes, but I don't know how to hold tension in this. But so here's the gist of it, I think, is that, I mean, what that verse communicates to us is that God always had the plan to slay his son Jesus on the cross for us. That was always the plan. And so I think so many people, though, the way they think about even their own lives is that so much has been left to chance and so much has just happened in the way that it has happened. And what I see in that verse, in this Galatians 4:4, it's not that God, in his mind, the Son had been slayed already. And so God's just flipping a book through history and he's like,
boom.
Okay, he's going to come December 25th, 4 BC.
Right.
Like, I think what Galatians 4:4 tells us is like, no, that God was working everything up until this moment of history. And it was the fullness of time. Fullness of time geopolitically, fullness of time socially, fullness of time spiritually speaking.
Right.
And so what it shows us is that God is not random at all.
And the word we use for that is providence.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Providential. Sovereignty. Yes.
Yeah.
And so if he's that way with the cross and Jesus paying the penalty for the sins of the world, if he did it on a grand scale with his Son and the salvation plan, it got me to thinking as I was writing the sermon, like, I think that plays out. I think that becomes the model in the individual's life as well. So in the same way that God wasn't flipping through history deciding when he was going to send his Son, God wasn't flipping through the book of your life and just randomly pointing at something.
So were you just saying, like, at the perfect time, Christ reveals himself to you, Christ saves you at the perfect time?
Right, and so the next verse that came to mind is Romans 5:6-8,
right.
which says, what does it say again? For something along the lines of, I don't know exactly where to pick it up, but for at just the right time, Christ died.
When we were still powerless,
Christ died for the
ungodly.
At just the right time.
At just the right time.
And so what it shows me, I feel like what Galatians 4:4 is saying was that, man, God's a God of timing. You see it with Jesus when he came.
Right.
And then you see it in Romans 5:6-8. God's a God of timing in your life as well. And so in the same way that Jesus came at the historical point that he did, because everything geopolitically and spiritually was leading up to that moment, that in your life as well, there is a fullness of time moment where everything that has been in your book in the past, all this stuff that you've been labeling as hardships and trials and coincidences, or maybe just freak blessings, right place, right time, it was not just this random thing. And
Wow.
God didn't just like point to a random spot in your life, but instead God's been writing your book and your story, and that the point that you came to know Christ, that he revealed his Son to you, was the fullness of time moment in your life.
Perfect time. I think they need to talk about that. I think you guys need to talk about that. Let's talk about in your groups right now. And I don't know how long this is going to take because this is really important stuff, but let's talk about that moment, your fullness of time moment where you encounter Christ at the perfect time. Spend some time sharing your testimonies and talking about what was going on in your life and why that moment, that time you heard the gospel, it clicked. Go ahead and do that right now.
That's great. So if I can add in there, okay, you're back.
Yeah.
Press play. Okay.
Press play.
So if I can add to a little bit of side homework, I don't know, can I do this? Can I refer out people to listen to some other church's sermons?
Just the co-pastors aren't going to watch this anyway, so go ahead.
So there's a sermon that I think is so good that has really impacted me, and I know co-pastor Paul McGill loves it as well, but it's the Stephen Furtick sermon from Elevation Church titled "It Had to Happen." Mm-hmm. And it's talking about how when the Apostle Paul was shipwrecked on an island, it was like a terrible circumstance. He was shipwrecked. He was a prisoner, by the way, on that ship when he was shipwrecked. And then they went to build a fire, and as he's building the fire, a snake bit his hand. And you would think, oh my gosh, this man is cursed. Like, just go ahead and die already. And what winds up happening is, as a result of the snake biting his hand and the venom not affecting him, he actually got to talk to the leader of this tribe of people living on this island and converted him. Yeah. And so Furtick's message, go watch it on YouTube, Stephen Furtick, It Had to Happen. His message was, it had to happen. The bad stuff in your life had to happen to reveal God's purpose.
Absolutely.
And for you to realize it. And so, man, I just think this is something that's so important because I think the crazy thing, the thing that separates us Christians out from the rest of the world is really not that we're living a different reality than the rest of the world, but that we're living a different perspective of the reality that we're going through.
There it is.
And so what it does for us is you can get to a place where the most painful things that have ever happened in your life, that you actually praise God for those things.
Yeah.
And I know the divorce sucked, and it was really painful, and it felt like your soul was ripping apart. And if you could go back, you would change it, and you would never go through that again. But I believe God can actually get you to a place where you say, man, really, to get me to where I am today, it had to happen.
Absolutely. And we find out that the things that we struggle with today, we call them testimonies tomorrow.
Yes.
Because those are the things that God will use to glorify himself in your life and in the lives of other people. And so the things that's killing you today are going to give life to other people tomorrow.
Yeah.
And that's wonderful. Can you think, just really personal, since we're about to ask them to do it, like what is a thing that you were surprised that God used that was like a providence moment for somebody else, but that you had to endure?
Oh man. Well,
That's a
really
question.
good. Yeah, that's a really good question. Thanks for putting me on the spot. Like right
you're
here
welcome.
In the moment. I think for me to give a super thoughtful, meaningful answer, I'd have to think about it for a little while. But
For sure.
I would just say my own struggle with the anxiety stuff that I've put out there, and some difficulties in my life that I've gone through that have kind of incited and exacerbated some of my anxiety stuff has actually become, I think, it has made me so much of a better preacher and so much of a better pastor to people, because it's like I speak from this place sometimes I speak from this place of woundedness that I think connects with people. So I'm just saying, like, I think my own struggles with anxiety, some of the events that led up to me really dealing with anxiety, hate all that stuff.
Yeah.
But also looking back, I'm so thankful for my journey with anxiety and those events that happened that led me to that place, because it has led me to have so much more of a richer and deeper ministry than I ever could have.
And I have to just amen you on that, because I have benefited from that. And what has been incredible is that because you're willing to be honest about the things that you've struggled with in your life, and you're willing to say, God led me through these terrible moments, I can say that there's hundreds of people in our congregation who have heard you talk about this, whose lives have been changed because of it. And when we do that, Christ, like God's word really is true. His strength is made perfect in our weakness.
Yeah, totally.
And all of those things become a benefit because we don't suffer in isolation.
Yeah.
Like we suffer in part of a community and everybody benefits from it. I myself was abused terribly as a kid, terribly. And I never understood it, and it never had a context in my life until much later, when the first part of my ministry career is I'm 20 years a youth pastor. And I used to speak a lot more at youth conventions and things like that. And I would run into just all these kids who were also victims of abuse. And I got to tell them how God led me through that and what the process was and all of those things. And I can tell you guys honestly that God redeems everything. And all of those moments, if you're just willing to be honest about what it is that you're struggling with and allow people into that conversation, those become powerful ways that God in his providence can impact the church and impact our community. Yeah. Because one of the other things that you teach us in this sermon is that Christ not only saves us at the perfect time, but he sends us at the perfect time.
Yeah.
And the things that we often feel like are coincidence are actually just that, they're providence. They're God working in the world. So why don't we take a second, now that we've been very vulnerable about how God has used us in these moments where we weren't expecting to be used, in these ways we weren't expecting to be used. Why don't you guys take a moment to talk about how God has used your moments and your weaknesses, and in those moments that you thought were just coincidence, maybe, actually ended up being these divine appointments, these providential appointments, and opportunities for you to impact other people's lives.
Yeah. And we're back. So it's my favorite thing to do.
So I think as we wrap this discussion up, man, I have to say this whole series has been wonderful because I think it gives us a framework and understanding for God. There's so much that we learn that is just like topical and emotional and things like that. And man, this has just been solid biblical theology studying. And it's been great. I appreciate your heart in that. Do you have any closing thoughts as we wrap this series up?
No. Other than, I guess, maybe the takeaway from the series for me is that at the end of the day, if an in-depth study of the person of Jesus doesn't result in a greater sense of personal connection, personal appreciation, personal worship for him and what he's done in your life, then we've probably missed it as a
for
church.
sure.
And so I feel like we started with this idea. So, I mean, just to give you the fancy theological term for what we've been discussing in this series is the hypostatic union.
Yeah.
Which sounds so like this crazy hypostatic. What does that even mean? Well, it's the idea that Jesus was fully God and fully man. And so it's this really high and lofty theological idea that there's so much meaning to it. And I think that's important and that's good. But what we've tried to do is teach how that really high-minded theological idea actually, like why it is actually important in your life. And at the end of the day, our hope is that it's caused you to see Jesus in a new way and appreciate him more and trust him more.
Yeah, and I would just say, like, what you believe about God and who you believe Christ was, all of those things matter, not just for your eternity, but really your day-to-day. What you believe about God matters.
Absolutely.
So that's all I've got.
Thanks, Rocky.
Thank you, man.
Yeah, it's good.
Thank you, guys. We'll see you later.